Hello everyone, today we talk about the professor's mistakes, faults, everything that I have been listening in my personal experience regarding, in fact, a broader, not necessarily incompetence altogether, but let's say the indicators in scholarship of that kind of lack of, broader or specific awareness that is a significant starting point, in my opinion, in order to, first of all, explain what the entire deal of this work and of that environment, because there are two different things, really is. And of course, signaling in that sense, what are the causes of this too? Where does this deficiency stem from? And also, how does it compare to other forms of historical learning, and or a different, not just in different jobs and different levels of of learning and of teaching, but also generationally, and or what is wrong, in fact, with the way we think history, that, as you know, is a bit our broader interest on Schwerpunkt. So from one side, I will list literally the mistakes that I've heard mostly being said, not much the ones that I've found like in articles or anything. I will probably quote something about that too. Naturally, it's much easier to be wrong when speaking, right? The more you speak, and the more the chances of making mistakes. So I speak a lot. I'm sure that I make my own fair share, and that's this aspect is very important. But in my opinion, the most important one, that is not just okay, let's evaluate the information. It's, however, how you deal with that eventually, right? And so what really should recover, in my opinion, as the broader deal is, what is the person, right? And why are they doing what they do, and how responsible they are for what they say, and how does their attitude change the matter for the better, or unfortunately for worse, right? Again, the mistake in itself is understandable. We are not unfailable, so the point shouldn't even be taken in consideration. But at the same time, we have some standards. So if you repeat that systematically, and or in any case, any mistake is not just devoid of a context. It's specifically made within, for example, a given expertise. So with boundaries that you can more or less understand. Of course, if say an anthropology professor doesn't know philology, everybody, the mistakes that this person can do stem from the fact that you say, okay, well, that person has not gone through the process, but it's still important, so that they can't know the minutiae of it, but it's still important to see how the person eventually handles such statements, and what kind of attitude has towards expertise, but also the method in itself. And perhaps I should say, that in my Historian playlist I have dealt copiously with things like method, expertise, learning, studying, what happens at an academic level regarding to these things. We have, I already listed actually some of the mistakes that I've heard, but let's say the effect that they make as a broader memory, resonating eventually in the work that you do, that fundamentally widens also the perspective, the understanding of those same, the meaning, the value of those same statements is another thing. And I'll try to essentially explain it to you from this perspective. On the other hand, I want to reflect on in fact, on what I think interests you even possibly more. That is to say, but what about this great professorial knowledge? What does scholarship really do? And how does this differ essentially from the average person's attitude and knowledge of history, and how can we distinguish the quality even there? That's a bit another topic. I think I already discussed it years ago, like saying, is it necessary to for example, to get a degree or any title to be competent expert? That's a very interesting topic. I will probably come back on it at some point, because in the meanwhile, I got through quite interesting things that, clarified a bit also what are the boundaries, the contents, and so on. And the point being this, that as you know, I am pretty supportive of expertise. I think a great deal of today's problems derive from the in part properly the lack of education at the satisfactory level among people, right? An absolute increase doesn't tell anything, right? And this attitude is exactly the one that has been polluting expertise itself. That is to say, we evaluate just quantity and not quality, and especially regarding such a moral dimension like learning and so on, you can't quite have an attitude like that. You must have some order of sorts, some criterion, and not merely just, there are more literate people today, but what do they actually know? And are they even more intelligent? Are they, what is that they are habituated to think like, to process information like, and to store it also, and to use it and employ it? They're two completely different things, and we are probably literally playing with fire regarding the overall complete lack of any need/interest for a more comprehensive educational policy. I can speak Europeanly because I believe there should be a European school, but this is valid for the entire world in the first place. And Schwerpunkt naturally a bit exemplifies what I think things should be like, and not because I say or do here everything that I would like, but let's say I'm at least trying to provide something that at least remains up to some specific standards and goals and objectives. And this video instead will sound more like, experts, say against expertise, because it's today's fashion to pretend that if you criticize an expert, automatically you are going to feel better than that person or to be morally relieved. That's actual relativism. It has nothing to do with that, right? If an expert is not an expert, it means that there is no expert, and nor you are one, right? Unless you actually are, which entails a very specific path and formation and skill and so on. So no, this video is not to be intended automatically like that, because I know that's how, generally speaking, the mood, the direction in which the interpretation tends to immediately take over. Because as soon as you give something, especially to the people, like they think they're better because they have to cope with their own complexes of inferiority, and this is absolutely none of that. This is rather, something destined to, of course, everyone, like my content is, but to show you what is the damage brought by a decadent expertise, or at least some aspects of the expertise shortcoming that are not supposed to be there, and that at some point didn't quite exist, because there has been, of course, a historical transformation in also in method and approach, in language, even in communication. So all these topics would be worth a specific video. As you know, it's something I often say, but it is real, because even if I talk for 2 hours in a row, I will hardly manage to give you not the basic concept that I may have already outlined in in these first minutes, but the dimension of that. Right. This is, in my opinion, we'll stress it even with the examples I'm going to list. The fact that it doesn't take just to say, okay, I'm from this side, like for anything, even in politics, etc. I'm from this side or another. I believe in this and that. If you don't do anything about that, right? And most of the say the reason of why people eventually do not do anything, of course, is that it requires effort, work, but most of the people, before having done it ever, do not have a dimensional idea of how, in fact, how much that is. And so they are convinced that it just takes to take a stand, and even though they're not able to withstand anything in that regard, but still it's going to do. And that's the entire attitude that you can observe in political commentaries and so on. It's the reason why everything has shifted to identity politics as opposed to individual worth, and that nobody tells you today that we have to resort to all the idea that people are extremely different, and that this difference is evaluated not on everybody's special in their own way, but most suck, and there are just very good people that are highly qualified and thus are better people, because on average they're definitely more capable, more fruitful, more just they have the capacity also of elevating the others in this mechanism. And simply by inertia, you're not going to listen much of that. Instead, I have fundamentally built my channel on this concept, and I can't stress enough how important this is. So in the list, I will skip all the bullshit that I've heard when I was in school, because of course, you have to understand that I presume I'm stern but fair, right? To me, every category sucks, right? There is not a category in the world where the average is being satisfactory up to the standards that were fixed, even just empirically. So I think historians suck. I believe archaeologists suck. This all on average. I'm a historian myself, and I think historians suck. I come from a family of doctors, and I think doctors on average suck. I believe everybody sucks. I don't know any people, any culture, any profession, any group, any religion that the members of which fundamentally are not grossly incompetent, ignorant, lazy, cowardly, weak individuals, right? And this is simply a matter of standards, as you understand. So it's not that I reject the fact that we all, so including myself, have these problems, but the thing that changes all is whether you're willing to improve or not, right? So this is gonna roast lots of categories, but I must say that especially towards school teachers, and not that I had particularly bad ones myself, but in general, for what I've seen in my direct experience, but also around me and abroad and wherever really, school teachers are some of the most disgustingly undereducated people that you can ever meet. Like, being a school teacher on average means that you're just an average moron who needs money to carry out a shitty life, pretending they have any form of culture that they don't, because they simply do not come from familiar backgrounds that provided them with any form of dignified education or culture, whatever, and that pretend to teach, in fact, spoiled brats like they were, that, of course, at large also come from families that are disgustingly undereducated, culturally underdeveloped, whatever, and so they don't even give a shit about their own children's education, that are, yes, more stupid than an adult on average, but that sometimes, especially when they grow up in middle school, high school, are definitely capable of blasting their same professors because, at least there is somebody that reasons. And I must say that I got myself in trouble multiple times and seriously, so even actually also at university, because I was extremely lucky, telling you the truth, but I did have mild conflict with teachers and professors because I pointed out that what they were saying was wrong, was incorrect. So there are interesting stories also from school, and most of that is not just even about this, tete-a-tete, let's say, but rather the broader expression of this person. I mean, once I found a geography teacher that didn't know that Sinai is in Asia and not in Africa. I found a professor who literally thought that the name of the German city of Trier it was the Roman, the Latin one today. I found, of course, teachers that came from areas of the country that didn't know how to speak properly our language, our official language, because of their heavy dialect. And these were actual teachers. Yes, mostly they were kind of, those graphic, like technical education, whatever that thing is. So there were also the B series kind of teachers. But it was disgusting enough overall, right, to look at the incredible, it's not just a cultural misery, but it's a personal misery, right? You understand that these people didn't receive a good education themselves, and they are teachers, inexplicably enough, if not because you start understanding, especially in middle school, that the entire educational system sucks. I must say that in my case, in primary school, I was quite happy, and I had teachers that were actually scumbags for reasons that, however, fortunately didn't have much to do with our, in fact, our teaching activities, but rather for how they ran some aspects of the school, and we even sued them. And as a kid, I didn't even leave that. I must say that they were nice with me, even though my family sued them, and also the ones of other students, but essentially prompted by my family and all those kind of things. But I must say that was a very happy period of my life, first of all, but secondly was also probably a good one. I didn't receive the impression those teachers were bad. I could perceive the fact because, say, when I got home, my father asked me, like, well, what did you learn today in school? And I said things, and he always complained about this, such, this teacher don't teach you anything, and so on. So I could perceive already that sense of squalor that derived from that public education. Actually, that in my country is actually good, right? And especially in at least in the institutions they attended. So, this is rare, but I understand that also other public education in some countries are better than the private ones, and I have no complaints in that sense. That there is all a broader reflection we should make about not just the teaching in itself, but let's say of the single subject, but also what's the broader experience, how many kids there are there, how do you learn growing up among other people, and so on. This is another thing. But specifically the ignorance, yes, I do remember it. And I do remember it, especially also in the uncertainty of the question. Like sometimes, it's not that I would ask much, especially in middle school, in high school. You are in that mood in which you just want to be left alone. You don't engage excessively, at least directly, in what the teachers really tell you. Not very passive, but just by listening to them, because you're terribly bored just to be there. And that's where you start evaluating more autonomously the teacher's capacity, and you're able to distinguish maybe a professor can be an asshole, but he can know better, right, than another that is milder but is more ignorant. So there are many shades in this, and I must say that the most competent teachers regarding probably their specific subject were the ones, of course, who had come, we're talking about high school in this case, from probably a university career of some sort. I knew, for example, my math physics teacher in high school was I think also both of them they had been teaching at some point at university. there was an English teacher who had been raised in America, and so she knew how to speak. But for example, she was kind of dumb and she was kind of ignorant. So except from some pronunciation, yes, of course, she habituated us speaking in some degree of fluency. But I mostly learned English in middle school, so that I lived of rent afterwards during high school. But in general, let's say, especially high school was better. Like it was a very good school. It was actually one of the best in my country, if anything, because people who passed from there normally scored very high in national competitions and so on. They became all kind of top people of some sort. And this is not to flatter myself, because at the end of the day, I thought that if that was the best, like, it was not that much. Like, what I consider myself lucky for, especially, is to have attended that high school, because I realized it was one that gave you the opportunity to learn if you wanted to, right? And I've never met in my life an institution that, especially this is important for school, that is very intensive, as I understand, like where you had to learn, and if you didn't, you were out, right? There was always some sort of mediation and negotiation about that, of which I was not happy. It was very stern. In those times, I didn't like the fact that some people who didn't do anything would pass. Not because I hated them, because just I thought it was fair, right? There were also some friends of mine there, but I was being objective. Like, this person doesn't do shit. Why should they be saved in the first place, right? Even if they have personal tragedies, as has happened at some point, or they, they maybe did well in, say, they weren't bad people in general. I think discipline is also important. But these are all topics that we have to deal separately, because they entail actually very, very important considerations regarding that moment of the formative age. And that's why today I want to talk about that, because when you go to university, you're first of all an adult, and consequently you're expected to just be able to be functional enough. It's to learn things, otherwise really you are out. Even though there is a negotiation there too, still you're talking essentially to the top experts available, right? It may not be the top experts in the world singularly, but let's say I must say that my university is quite highly ranked within Europe, and even though people generally speaking don't even know it exists, because people do not have, also students do not have a real idea, in fact, of the whole of the world, of this kind of European identity or local educational traditions or whatever. So there is an incredibly twisted, distorted kind of view of even what educational quality really means. And there are very opinable indicators very often. So I must say this, that yes, at university, practically all the people that I've met, in terms of effective teachers, professors, were competent, right? I could find, as I will explain now, some saying atrocious things in my perspective for what should be, in fact, these standards that I think that level of education should be worth. But I guess this makes it even more interesting, because you can see the jarring contrast between a very high expertise and, let's say, mistakes that, frankly, I would have not done even when I was in high school myself. So that shows you very interesting from the outside, because you're not in somebody's head. However, it's a bit like a historical reconstruction. What did these people go through, right? This is something that eventually comes up when you start working with professors also for years. You're more interested also in the future of the academic thing. You say, well, where did that person study? Who were their teachers? What kind of education did they receive? What did they write? Right? It's very important to look at somebody's curriculum, publications, and say, well, I understand this person comes from this path, has been studying these specific things. And obviously enough, at that level of expertise, the thing narrows to ever more restricted topics that they will have to know in great detail, and making thus the investing literally on quality at that point, not on quantity of knowledge. This is also a controversial point that, as you know, I often discussed, especially if you have been following me for years, you know that I believe there should be a very solid general, a very solid base, right? I'm talking literally about the things that you learn at the first year of university that also in theory are, aside from some more exotic language that you do not, you hadn't known before, what you had learned in school, right? What you studied the first year, you study, again, medieval history, modern history, contemporary history, etc. It's essentially a slightly more advanced structured material than the one you had in high school if you had studied it thoroughly. There is an important difference. Like if you look at high school manuals, you realize that they're written by people with less historical intelligence. So that is a further step, but we're talking, say, in terms of that negotiation, mostly of things that you should have known also before, right? I've seen horrifying things today. I will not even talk about the criteria of evaluation, because that's also, frankly, what really goes wrong in university. Like, all these institutions could be improved simply by hiring the standards, right? Making the criteria of evaluation harsher, right? You would immediately have a dramatic increase in the quality, in the selection, right? So that only the best go on. And no, I don't believe absolutely that there is such a thing like, people cannot really, people are different and they can't understand a thing rather than another as opposed to someone else because they are them, right? There are those kind of inclinations, this is true. And there are also some professors that frankly are terrible at their job, because teaching is not examining, it's not knowing, there are all different things. Like, for example, I have a very high opinion of certain professors that I like and all, but exams with them were terrifying, not because they were particularly difficult, but because you had studied a lot, you sat there, and they started talking about things that had nothing to do with that. Because they wanted to stimulate you to think about something else. But okay, I studied that given topic, why don't you ask me, right? I found some, at least there is an anecdote from a colleague who once went to an exam, and the professor was angry because the guy had learned exactly what the professor had said. And this professor threw the book at him and said, "You studied exactly what I said. You have to, reason with your own mind." This kind of also, frankly, bizarre attitudes, because professors can be also clinical cases sometimes. And there are many examples of that, as a matter of fact, because they're strange normally. I mean, I think that especially it's not because of what they learn, but because it's because of the type of job that very often is much more choking than even their own education. Like, they're submerged in bureaucracy, in bureaucratic issues and so on. So they sometimes do everything but teaching in practice as a general activity. And so you need certain types of people that, in that sense, are not necessarily the best ones for teaching specifically, or even at human interaction or something like that. But this is also another thing. Today I talked just about the specific things that I found professors not to know, and that made me reflect altogether about, who's a professor, how do they learn, and how is it the thing. Also because in theory, I'm doing the same thing that takes to become one. And so, as you know, I'm quite... even though I hardly ever talk about myself, even in the same videos I make, you can understand I'm introspective, because I'm kind of talking with myself in part to find the right solution, the right words, what can really deliver the message effectively and precisely in explaining the thing which is hard. And that's the reason why I talk so much. And people say, "Oh, I don't want to watch 2 hours uh, of this because I want the damn explanation." But you can't quite have it just by itself. Like, this is something that strikes me about YouTube as well. That again, here you can have literally anybody talking, but people watch only the 5 minutes videos. And of course, because the average person doesn't give a damn about more complex things, and this is kind of also respectable. I also want to watch stupid things every once in a while. But the point being is that sometimes you find people that are so habituated to that kind of rhythm that they say, "Well, but you talk for 2 hours." Well, yeah, because this is a topic that requires being discussed for 2 hours. Like when you go to university and you want to learn, that chapter of the book, well, the professor will condensate that in literally 1 hour and a half. And what does the student do? Well, can't you do it in 10 minutes? Doesn't make any sense, because you're there exactly to get the process that makes you understand the thing, not just receiving passively an information that, exactly because you lack the structure of you cannot absorb at the end of the day, and you will twist and you will re-elaborate yes, but in the wrong way, remembering just what you want. That's also how you start learning, but at some point you also should be habituated to kind of more structured content. Alright, so I haven't even prepared properly the list. I'm just going to go by heart here. One mistake that struck me, I remember it was the first year, and I think it was the first lesson of modern history, was this professor making a broader introduction. Of course, those basic lessons are somewhat useless, right? You hardly learn anything. If anything, you just learn to stay with the others, and there are all these kids, very often including yourself, that will want always to raise their hands and show that they are knowledgeable because they don't know how it works there. That's terribly annoying, because not much because this has been seen all before and everybody knows why you're doing this, but because the things that are said normally are extremely stupid and ignorant, right? And that's why people are there to learn and not just to hear to these things. But I remember the professor making a broader introduction, and she was competent, by the way. Like, as I said before, all these professors are people with very respectable curricula and with, in fact, pretty consistent amount of publications and so on. So you really know they did work, they did do their own, and they're qualified to talk about that. But the basic exams are so often separated, let's say, from the degree of hyper-specialization they have acquired, that in fact they can say pretty dumb things that confuse, in this sense, the student gets there to get the basics. I remember, for example, this modern history professor starting from, say, the end of the Roman Empire to speak about modern history, and I appreciated that, at least today, in perspective, because finally modernists that had a bit more of consideration for the Middle Ages, at least their own way. I don't even know about her specifically. Maybe she was one of the worst in that sense. But I remember she said, she confused the I don't remember exactly the sequence, but she said she blended in three historical events, mistaking the name, the date, and the content. She said specifically about, let's say, the Edict of Caracalla in the year of the Edict of Milan, with the content of the Edict of Thessalonica. In other words, she said that in 313 the Edict of Caracalla was issued, made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. So blending basically 2 centuries of different, emperors, different edicts, and so on, with different content. So you understand the degree of broader confusion. So you would say, well, this is maybe a lapsus. Well, you see, it takes a lapsus normally is when you're literally thinking about something else, you say one word for another. This, even the fact that you have to conceive differently date, name of the emperor, content of the edict, puts your brain in a state of application that should be aware of all these 3 points at once. And if you say something like this, it means that you screwed up basically the entire late Roman history chronology and the broader dynamics of, in that case, of Christianization and or the broader change in late antiquity for all the different contents of the edict and different phases that they corresponded to. The first one, of course, has not even to do with Christianity. So that was, and she was referring specifically about this. I mean, the Christianity, the final full Christianization of the Roman state. So I never had the opportunity to examine her on that topic, but my impression is that, yeah, she may be a modernist, but she probably doesn't know much about the rest of history, and or she has a very superficial approach to that. And especially, again, considering that you're making a lesson that it's telling literally the fundamentals of history to students that in practice you also know, even though they already should from high school, but it's just an illusion. This kind of that do not know this kind of information. So this is different from, let's say, what for example, I've already forgotten myself. It is the name of all the Roman and Byzantine emperors by heart that at some point in this basic exams I had mandatorily to do, which is also, I don't know how many people really do this, but it's not really difficult, but it does require a form of application. That's one thing, right? You may also not know exactly every single emperor, every single and the various years and so on, the sequence of them. But let's say things like the Edict of Caracalla, the Edict of Milan, and the Edict of Thessalonica are, especially for anyone, right, for a historian in general, you must know them. And there is no way out of that, right? It's, as you understand, it's the basics. Again, this is the point, that if you don't know why these are the fundamentals, you may rest assured that this is a big problem, right? If there is something that went wrong in the broader background of your historical education of some sort, right? I know it's unpleasant to acknowledge. I don't know statistically how many people were interested in history, maybe just pictured this kind of events, but that's a very powerful indicator that the person is not really aware of the period, and this shouldn't come from a professor. Doesn't matter whether a university professor of modern history, still, she had to know. Interestingly enough, I had gotten tired of that. I don't remember. I think this was either the first or the second lesson. I was as always, extremely bored to be there. Right? To me, attending university classes is one of the single most useless, boring thing I've ever had to do. And since it's largely facultative, I think when she said this, or something else that I don't remember now, because I had already been spotting 3-4 mistakes of that level, and she cared very much about people remaining during the lesson, so not seeing walking away. I remember I walked away, and she even told me, "Hey, you, what are you doing?" And I slammed the door and went away. And I hope she wouldn't recognize me. In fact, she wouldn't, because this was a huge class. Anyhow, at the exams, where when I basically corrected her during the exam, she had messed this. I really don't remember, but she had messed up the Habsburg chronology. At the very end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the modern era, she had swapped, I don't know, Margaret with Eleanor of France and Portugal, or something like that. And at the time, I remember I told her as well, like that, yeah, because she said, "Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, I made that mistake." She avowed me, and I said, "Well, that's something that can happen." I remember that. I knew that, as it was just a broader, a relatively minor detail during the examination. The broader, just the modern age, and if it had not been for my mother, who bombarded me since childhood with the Habsburg history of those generations, I would have not known the genealogy correctly. So those are the kind of things that not even school or university can do for you. This is a deeply important thing, and I accepted that for example was a normal mistake to be confused in that moment just about it, because especially if you don't, well, I must avow that she was specialized in the 16th century as well, so maybe that was worse than saying, opposed to say, well, maybe she studied the 18th, where the say Charles V, his family and so on were kind of a bit of a different time and era altogether. But it struck me because I don't remember what, but I hadn't answered her correctly on something during the examination as well. And so she told me something. She was impressed by the fact that I had corrected her, and she gave me the full mark, even though she said, "You didn't really answer everything correctly, but you deserve this because I see that you are a bit more like, I don't know, remember what she said, but I had this kind of ambition." That's something that I was told also on another occasion, a terrifying exam of Germanic philology, where I don't remember if I had something to criticize that person, but in general, I remember her. She was just rude, and one of the few exams that actually I did actually pass, but I refused the mark because I was proud about that. She had been mocking me and another guy. We had made the examination as medievalists with her because she mostly had just linguists with her, and I hated her for that behavior because she was definitely rude. Like, professors don't do this all the time. She was just plainly mocking us because we didn't know history, like saying things like that. And I remember once we met, I met her again at there was a class that we were holding outside the curriculum, or there was some host during a class I was attending with my tutor, I think. It was about codicology or diplomatistic or something like that, and we're studying, these were some seals from, were from the 10th century, the 9th century even, but this person was invited, this professor was invited, and she looked at one of these seals and at first said, "Oh, is this the one of Charlemagne?" The one of Charlemagne is pretty famous, like for any medievalist, and especially somebody who studied Germanic philology. The figure of Charlemagne, and she studied even those high medieval times, is like known. That she's, again, allegedly a very punctilious person who knows, languages, philology, phonetics, scripts, and so on, and you can't distinguish as an authoritative figure the seal of Charlemagne, like the Charlemagne's signature, that is pretty famous in medievalistics in general. So that made me understand that also, that person could be particularly competent in certain topics that I couldn't even discern well myself to express a judgment on her specifically, but she didn't know something so basic that I think you don't even need to study to have seen lots of times being able to distinguish and saying it out loud in front of other professors, so to appear like you're just an idiot fundamentally. But the atmosphere was quite relaxed. Probably nobody really cared about this, but we had that professor that we had invited talking us about this topic, so somebody had joined to make a mass, let's say. And I noticed, though, and I don't forget these kind of things. I remember there were surely many other mistakes that I've seen scattered during the basic history exams. Now I don't remember exactly the details of everything, but even the narrative of professors is quite important. There was a medieval history professor whom I liked personally. She was even good looking one, and we always chatted, and we except she studied history of economics, medieval economics, and she was my first professor at university, at least the one I scored the first mark with. um, ever. There was a full one, and I impressed her, and she remembered me, so she thought it was kind of the cool one, even though I've never really passed for the excellent student, especially the more I went on. But I don't really know, because I don't really know how other people see me openly, because I don't even communicate that much. And I remember she was called to this later on, of course, to conclude at the end, actually, of my university path, because she was, I don't remember what's the title, she was called to counter my thesis, right? I wrote my master thesis with my tutor, and this other professor was called to be a bit like the devil's advocate of some sort. And she was critical of some things in a way that perhaps was connected that year to the fact that I had destroyed her pupil during the PhD competition, the selection. And she went a bit hard on some things. I mean, amicably, but in ways that were somewhat dumb. I had written a thesis on the Battle of Dörnkot and Speigen, which I will also make videos on. And she said, but here I don't see anything about economics. Like, isn't there like an indentured contract there that you could document? I had read the entire historiography on that battle. I wrote extensively. She should have known, generally speaking, like as a broader context, that I don't know, maybe there are some documents of that kind, but especially this fixation with economics there in this contract. Well, I'm talking about the campaign and the battle. What the hell does that have to do with that in the first place? There are completely different problems that, again, I started in economics would think they are important just because they don't know anything about military history, and they think that just because you have a contract that says how much a knight was paid will change our military understanding. It doesn't really, right? How much a knight costed, you can see from a political and strategic point of view first and foremost. If your best hiring contract will be a couture of that, a confirmation of that, nothing more. It's not central, given the much bigger picture. She didn't even know that, what the German ministeriales were, because she studied, in fact, history of economics, where there is a lot of ministeriales, especially in my country. We studied very much post-Carolingian times, where the ministeriales were still in the form of kind of civilian administrators. And for anybody who knows the Middle Ages, I think I made an entire playlist on this. The German ministeriales are notoriously, in the High Middle Ages and Late Middle Ages, the servant knights of Germany that are the majority. So it's a big historiographical topic of European dimension. Everybody kind of knows that. I had written an entire thesis on it that she pretended she had read to correct, and she didn't even know that, right? That's the kind of, like, of course I didn't even take her seriously. I was just mild and say, oh yes, this is true, yes, I should have seen this better, yeah, you're right, yeah. And then, because I always kind of mocked her in a way, because I knew, even I remember from the first year of those classes of the basic medieval history class, that she surpassed certain things. She condensed them. She wasn't particularly knowledgeable about it. And I once heard her talking at a conference about in fact economic issues, and she was competent about that. And I didn't expect her to be that smart, let's say, on that topic. So that showed me, importantly, how much also a professor can be alienated. And I've always liked her in the end. Again, because there is maybe this personal alchemy of some sort. I just saw her recently. But I also met with other colleagues at that point, also during the doctorate, or during the doctorate selection, that knew her, and they openly said, I don't think she's that good as a professor. They said. I don't want to be that evil to say it's true, because, again, on her, I never studied her work, so I can't speak for that, right? And it's sadly normal, but this is true instead, that there is that kind of blindness towards kind of general basic history and medieval history, and things that will intersect with your knowledge. Even just again on that battle in the context, you know that that region in that century doesn't produce that type of sources that you're asking me for. It's a completely different. It means that you've never entered with your mind there. This is also sadly common that people study just one country and they don't even know what's beyond that. And you understand that because in order to know things in depth, you must really stay a long time on them, and you can't do it for every country, of course. But at the same time, like it's a country that that is close, that is that people study and know about, and so on. So especially in our broader Western kind of historiographical tradition, we know each other, right? So that didn't make me think. But say mistakes, broadly speaking, I've met probably too often to recall precisely. Once again, I studied a lot also of late Roman history during my medieval history degrees, let's say, courses. And I remember once there was, she was professor of history of religion, of Christianity specifically. There are two separated things in my department, by the way, that's interesting. And she was studying, because it's very fashionable in the last decades to do this, and there is an abuse, in my opinion, a disproportionate amount of studies on late antiquity as opposed to the Middle Ages, for example, even by the side of medievalists, right? And for reasons that I will not explain now, but as you understand, they have to do with the entire parabola of multiculturalism and all this stuff, and very marketably so, unfortunately. And she was essentially given it was a master class, but she was giving us a bit the basis, because this was a class that was a bit sidebar one, like it was not the core courses, so it was very facultative, more kind of specialistic. So paradoxically, this has to provide with people who come from other disciplines with, again, the basics for that topic. And she was actually taking this a bit of as an excuse, in my opinion, because the amount of evidence we worked on, and fortunately for us, for the exam, was actually limited, but she was kind of diluting it along the classes that she has to make legally in that amount of hours and so on. And I remember, it was extremely boring. There were people complaining there, but at least we had to do it. She was not displeasant. She was someone you would just listen to, but some of the content was somewhat terrifying, and she was just trying to, those people that kind of cringely try to catch up with the youth, right? Trying to find some points in common with some references to her times and your times, or something that you would hope would bridge them. Like saying, in my time, I don't follow football. I remember Platini still, that. Like, do you know him? Like, everybody remained a bit like, how do you come literally from the Stone Age? But aside from that, I forget even the single things she said, because some were brutal mistakes. Yes, I remember this one much. She was brought in Introduction to the Roman Army, and she said that we're talking about late antiquity, and she said that the Roman army was just voluntary, which at the time notoriously wasn't anymore, right? There was conscription and so on. So first of all, you don't know a major aspect, let's say, of the Roman military that in part was also involved in the topic, because we were studying the circumcellions and the Donatist question, and so also the some police, at least, measures were taken against these movements and so on. At some point, she said other things that didn't make sense, but once she came up saying, I think that the etymology of Rome, and this is totally random, right? Spacing on topics that have nothing to do with the subject matter. I said, I think the etymology of Rome is in common with the one of the Roma, of the Romani, right, of the Gypsies, kind of. And I was already tired of listening to her bullshit, and I made something like, everybody was silent, but she heard that. She didn't know who it was, but she said, well, maybe it's better if I don't, because, the etymology of Rome has from Rome, it's either Latin or Etruscan. It has to do with the idea of the mountains, of the hills. It has nothing to do with the Romani, the etymology and it's the travel. There's literally nothing connected with that. But this is a university professor teaching Roman history in that context. She doesn't even know what's the etymology of Rome. She mixes that with the one of Romani, and then you wonder sometimes where you can get some soft leftist bias, right? This idea of mixing everything because you have to change point of view and perspective just because you're too ignorant to have the right one that you need, that is only one, right? You need to know well and competently. And when I heard that, I didn't like that. And she said something like, she didn't see me. We were like 20 or 30 in the room, and she said, well, then, no, I didn't think, then it wasn't true. Well, I think I should stop saying stupid things. And I said something like, yeah. And at that point, she looked up and she saw it had been me. And then I risked, because she said, excuse me, do you have something to say? And I was looking away because objectively, I was, a bit of a cowardly act, and she had, she had recognized me, and I said, oh, then excuse me, are you? And I said, no, I don't. And I said, no, I'm fucked, because the exam, she's going to remember me. And I said no, and the exam ended again with me actually posing questions to her, such as once she had quoted the Jannah from the Bible and asked from the etymology, well, something called, and she didn't know the answer again, and I got a very high mark. And I remember this was also a person that my tutor called to revise my degree plan, because I wanted to study ancient history as opposed to the medieval one, and this had happened years ago, and the professor treated me like, this is just a guy that doesn't know what he wants, and he's making this problem. She was actually amazed by the number of history exams that we had in our course compared to her own times as well. And then when I ended up in that masterclass, I remembered that, by the way, these kind of episodes happen, and I basically ended up even posing her questions about things she had never heard of, about the Bible, about late antiquity, and I simply got the best mark. But she was gracious, because she probably remembered me, and she accepted that I was somehow, at least she had said something stupid, and that was true, and I was just pointing that out. She had said it over herself. But even that kind of superficial attitude, like, yeah, this thing of the Donatist controversy, you have read a bit of sources, but what's that class about, really? There's not a deep, thorough issue there. There you could have downloaded, 3 or 4 articles, reading the sources and making a bit of a couture of the whole topic and pretending that's a master class, right? You're not showing me an expertise. You're not showing me a broader interest in the period that you're actually teaching, that you have mostly been studying. And so, that's pretty lame, actually. And that's not something I want to see. I also took a number of Byzantine history classes every time I could, and this professor was very good, very nice. I liked him a lot. He also attended my master thesis discussion. It was very nice. Well, he was just there randomly, but nothing. And in fact, in the class we enjoyed the lessons, even though I mean, they were a bit boring because this guy was technically a philologist, and by the way, specialized also in 7th century Byzantine literature. That is, he told us that in the Hellenic studies, everybody mocks this kind of people because it's like the 7th century Byzantine literature is the darkest, most say contracted type of Hellenic literature to study and so on. But he liked this thing. He had never been to Constantinople in his life. He studied Byzantine history, and he was actually quite quoted in his own environment. He had published a lot of things and so on. But again, he was in fact, a philologist or a linguist. I don't remember exactly, and he was not a historian. But this class figured in the university, however, as Byzantine history, and we were mostly historians in the class, so he had to adapt the content a bit for historians. So he would have been just talking about obscure Byzantine authors and literature and broader poetic metrics and metrics, figures of speech, and all these things. And he said he was nice enough. He picked the standard Byzantine history manual, pretty concise one. He was harsh telling the truth. He wanted us to know a lot, and that was my type of exam because I tend to learn a lot by heart. And I got very high mark, but he wasn't giving you anything. But we liked him for this, and just he said something wrong here and there because he understood he was not a historian. Though I remember once, just a random thing, and that can be a lapsus, and or maybe not so much, but it's something you can't forget, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, this guy because he was not a historian, at least. And especially with a colleague of mine, we always watch each other while he was speaking, like saying, did you hear what I heard? Like if there was any mistake or something. Once he said, talking about Constantine had fought against the Picts, this Germanic people. He said, immediately I turned to my colleague and said, he said bullshit at the end of the class. We would kind of reflect on the topic because I think he said Celtic, and then he switched to Germanic. He said, well, no, I mean Germanic, because he was unsure of that. So it means that completely the ABC of Northern European ethnography there was not present. There were also people, I remember in his class, who didn't know much, because this is what it gets down to, that there are also many actually older people that go to university because they want to hear professors talking, especially a bit old-fashioned people who idealize culture and expertise in education. They say maybe these were doctors, engineers, even in their 60s, in their 70s even, and they would come there to listen. And you understand that they were history enthusiasts, but they didn't know much of that. I remember once again, Byzantine history corrected them about the principality / duchy of Benevent, because we were reading a passage in the professor that was talking about the principality, and this person that commented didn't know that the duchy was a principality, had become a principality this time. He said, but was it not a duchy? Well, if you know the history of that polity, you know that they switched it at some point. I remember, yes, this professor didn't know what the etymology of Saracens really were, because I asked unnecessarily, because I could just go, and we were thinking of the Syrians, etc. Said it's famously enough, at least the Sarkanoid were this tribe in Sinai, from which eventually the region the peoples took the name from, in Byzantine literature especially, and so he didn't know that, right? You would think a guy who has studied Greek, ancient, especially medieval sources, would know what's the etymology of Saracen. They maybe never had the time. There was a guy from the province who had studied hard, who had managed to become a professor. It's something you have to appreciate. But again, he followed that tunnel and didn't look even once left or right. he was sympathetic also because he always came back to his family in the weekends, and he didn't like to stay here. And he finally, at some point, came back to a closer university where he had moved from, and it was prestigious being here, but he couldn't bear that. But he would always be there, ready with the lessons, even if he was kind of dying of sickness or anything. So you understand there, you can forgive that person, because in part it's not his topic, in part it's just a sort of lapsus. For the rest, he has very thoroughly also written a lot of stuff. For example, this is one of the few professors who actually teaching with a incredibly thickly written note, so that he was just reading in a sense. That I don't see anything wrong in doing that either. If anything, he told us a lot of things more that we also had to learn specifically, had to know at the exam. So, we worked well, and I liked that way of working, even if it was hard. And this was a facultative exam, and I decided to do it always. And fortunately, you see, when he went away, I risked to. I had taken the last class with him, but he went away, and so I would have done the same a related exam with another professor that was instead a true philologist. She taught literally Byzantine literature in ultra detail, linguistically, literary, etc. Something that I would have never done myself, even though we were all historians and we said that. And she said, no, you do what I do. And fortunately enough, we managed to have still the guy making us the examination. Or I don't remember how we did it. I think it was written in form. I forgot about that. But let's say those are experiences that also make you understand how lucky you can be about certain given exams. Because let's say if you fail one, then the whole schedule is messed up. You don't know what the consequences can be. So it's important to rely on these human types as well. Then I remember there was Islamic history. These were also optional exams that, however, interested us because I thought, yes, I'm a medievalist. I must study Islamic history by some degree. I mean, I don't want to be ignorant in that. And also, more or less, I'm talking mostly about the bachelor degree, except maybe the very last example was still the master, because I took multiple at least Byzantine history classes over the years with that same professor. There was this other professor who was quite weird. First of all, his appearance was weird. Like here we walk into the Oriental Studies department, and it's a different world from our upstairs of the more rigidly monastic department of medieval history. And this guy immediately appeared like kind of a lefty, not necessarily the worst type of hippie type, but he was one of those white guys that, however, dress up like in Muslim, not literally traditional ways, but to try to mimic them in some way. He was kind of a weird person. And at the beginning, we were a bit like, because he was also a bit effeminate and so on. And we look at him and say, well, this guy's weird. And actually, he was normal, but he was also a bit complex, I must say. I had an argument with him because he didn't know shit. And this is the whole point of the story. I remembered, actually, I was thinking about something else. So there are many things he didn't know. He wanted to essentially, those teachers that want to change your point of view, that want to challenge you, to provoke you, but mildly, by trying to give you a broader picture of what we're talking about the medieval history exam, that honestly, to this day, even though we all passed the exams, the exam was extremely easy, and I also made peace with that guy, and he liked me eventually. I still don't know. It's still nobody at the time, still today, I presume, if I ask, knows what the hell was it about, like when it was located, what kind of history we were studying, because it was a completely vague thing. Yes, we managed to understand some aspects of, the broader differences of the Sunni, of the Shia, of the duodecimans, all these of the imams disappearing behind the column. But the whole teaching, even the same books that he gave us, that he wrote himself, were so cloudy, so strange that you didn't even know what was the point of it all. But fortunately enough, he was not asking us to know things, by heart, literally, and so on. So he just wanted to immerse us in this broader world. And I must say, at the end of the day, it kind of worked, right? He kind of left us with an idea of the complexity of that. But this was specifically, it was set in the Middle Ages. That much I can't say. But any kind of century chronology also was pretty vague. But he made us understand, I think, fairly well some aspects of the broader currents of Islam, how the conflicts between them, what they were doing, what they believed in. And so it was interesting, but he was also introducing the whole thing by saying a lot of different bullshit. He literally didn't know the political history of these, of the region. Mostly we were talking about the Middle East. I remember once, first of all, he mistook, he said that the Seleucids were Semitic, which I complained about, and he took that as a mockery, and he literally aggressed me. He said, "How do you think you are?" And I said, well, absolutely, I didn't want to give that impression, because he was kind of, let's say, mocking, and I counter-mocked a little bit, because he said, what the fuck do you want? And he didn't like this, and it would be interesting to recall some other details of that, but he literally meant that the Seleucids were Semitic. I mean, in his own view, yes, he was understanding the fact that ruling from Syria and Mesopotamia, most of the people there were Semitic, but let's say you can't present a basic lesson saying, we have to think about the Seleucids were Semitic, for example. What does it mean? The Seleucids, first of all, is the name of a dynasty. And there were other mistakes he made, and so we were a bit skeptical about things we were doing. After we had that argument, I also didn't force hands. I stayed, but he picked me as the one who knew everything, right? And sometimes I literally didn't know certain things, but I kind of nodded, like saying, "Yeah, we have to keep up, keep on this mask at least." But once I remember, there was another colleague of mine, the guy, by the way, that we made kind of he was a modernist, but we made also our PhD together, that remembers these moments, because he's convinced that we had such a deep, experience in those lessons, which I don't think so, and that's also the reason why I mean, in a way, yes, but not how beautiful they could be. Like, if I never studied it, I don't have any expertise in Muslim history, but if somebody had told me, like, you're organized now, aside from the fact that I did teach some basic Islamic history, but in a lesson maybe just for the medieval basic examination, let's say make an entire course of medieval Islam. Well, I would have liked to talk specifically about all the various polities, and from the Rashiduns, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, Cordoba, the Fatimids. I have a substantial Islamic history playlist. Something even if you want to give a very broad idea of the Seljuks, of the Ayyubids, of the Mamluks, of the Timurids, and so on, you can't give it. And in fact, speaking of the last topic, there was this colleague of mine who asked the professor at the end of the lesson, like, but when did the Mamluks end? It was kind of, because this guy passes for a genius, and he's a modernist, and he should perfectly know that it was the Ottomans who at least put down the Mamluks from as an independent power in the 20s of the 16th century, and that's something that from the either from the medieval and definitely the modern history exam. So it's something you must know. It's the big topic, right? In the area, it's one of the few things you have to remember about them from a Western-centric perspective, even in our manuals. And I remember I was about to go out of the room, but I stopped for a while to hear from the distance the answer the professor gave to this guy who was asking him something so basic. And the professor answered, the Mamluks were destroyed by the Timurids when they invaded Syria. False, right? They weren't destroyed. I mean, they were defeated and so on, but Egypt remained Mamluk. The thing didn't change that kind of balance. We're talking about essentially almost 1 century before the Mamluks were actually brought under by the Ottomans. And then I went out the room, and when in the corridor the guy also came out, of the room said, "Look, this guy told you bullshit." And he said, he told me bullshit. Well, of course, the Mamluks were not defeated by them. We were not, did not end because of Timur the Lame. And so, again, that's a teacher of Islamic history that deals with the Middle Ages, that should have at least a basic understanding of the macroscopic eras in the history of the major Islamic powers. You do not know who took out the Mamluks, that were essentially the major power in the Eastern Mediterranean, that were taken out by the Ottomans. That, in this sense, also accomplished one of the greatest feats in their expansion. Like, you literally do not know that. That's pretty weird. So what did this guy know in terms of basic knowledge? Right? It's pretty weird. Sometimes with my tutor too, whom she as you know, she followed me throughout all the theses that I wrote, bachelor, master, and doctoral. And sometimes she didn't know something. For example, she didn't know, while talking about the Franks, that the tomb of Chilperic I was discovered in the times of the Sun King. Because we're talking exactly about that phase of Frankish migration into Gaul, very gradual one conquest migration. It was an important topic. We were talking about basic stuff, and she had never heard of that. She had never heard, for example, of the division of Aquitaine from the original early Roman province into the Diocletian one, so that this generates questions of what kind of Aquitaine are you talking about. For example, in the Middle Ages, there are very important differences between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean watershed. It may be a bit more advanced stuff, but let's say in a broader political map of Europe and kind of a cultural one as well, these are things that, especially at her level of expertise, it was very high, especially about the early Middle Ages and the Franks, the Longobards, the popes, and so on. I think you should know. I think you should be able to substantiate in important ways. But you see, about her, for example, whenever I corrected her or I asked some things, she always told me, "Look, I don't know that. Like, I honestly don't know." She would always tell me. And that attitude was everything, because I never thought of her of being an ignorant. Because she also never said something that she was not sure of. Whereas other professors, the ones who said the aforementioned bullshit, and also kind of tried to, not to hide it in part, or were resentful about someone making them notice, were, in my opinion, worse professors. Instead, she said once, sometimes students come at exams and they tell you things that you have never heard, and you even wonder, or that at least in the way they're framed, that they may seem plausible, but you think they're wrong just for other reasons that you're factually sure. Since you have never heard of, you say, "But am I sure that this person is saying something wrong?" That immediately made you understand that she had a scruple about that. She wanted to be sure about things she taught and said to students, right? That's, to me, a pretty interesting aspect. In fact, I can't remember something wrong she really said, because she admitted, if anything, she didn't. It was rather me talking to her about things because I was very curious and I wanted to ask her things, as I did sometimes. I went to professors that I had never, let's say, that were open to questions in general, even aside from the classes and so on. I remember there was a professor of Roman history. I went to ask him, and he was very welcome. He said, please ask whatever you want here. I'm here for this. Like, he didn't have to, right? Normally, there is a general consulates to students for other issues, not just for spending 2 hours talking while the guy's at university, just because. And she would simply tell me, like, I don't know, I've never heard of this principality in Europe. There's some also important ones in maybe also in our own country. It was kind of weird. Now, even I don't remember the specifics of that, but she would always say she didn't know. That's incredibly important. I hardly ever say here that I don't know something, because normally the things I discuss, I first of all are generally enough to rarely be something I don't have some extra information on. But when I don't know, I also say I don't know that. I don't have problems. Of course, here I have a sort of image for which I'm not whining on myself for all the things that I don't know, because I have to give you the certainty and the clarity and the reliability that I think you deserve, but also the honesty and the sincerity. So if there is something that I really don't know, I will tell it. Also, if it's an important part of the story, I will probably check it out before. So I try to avoid that also in that positive sense. And that's what I think I noticed, generally speaking, lacking here. There were professors that hyper-specialized and that basically lost touch of any other, even general topic and knowledge. Right? I remember other mistakes. I heard that there are some mistakes I made myself, but the thing of admitting you don't know, or even being able to go on without being that also happens, right? That you make a mistake, but the professor understands that you are just more than enough, but maybe you make that little mistake. It's not that big deal. I think the professors have a higher burden in that regard, because they are the professors, so they are the qualified ones that would never be to be even doubted of in their knowledge, and or at least that's not the attitude that you should have, but that's in fact something you start learning quite quickly. In fact, not to be the case when you hear them speaking. Right, I think it's important, especially in the first years of university, to absorb as many information as you can. It's something you should have done already before. But that's the moment when you have to start build the big picture. So the more you bring in those years, the better it is. Your brain is shaped exactly to put that base together. And in the following years, this will be deeply felt. Other mistakes, or what professors didn't know, came, for example, from the doctorate, when I had to present my military historical project and discussing it. The professors wouldn't quite understand what I was talking about. It's not because we entered much into details and the technicalities of military history, and it's not even just entirely their fault, because I also was thinking a lot about what I had to do, and I often had a few time to explain, and so there was a communication problem there. But on multiple occasions I noticed that there were professors that basically didn't understand what I was doing. They wanted me to do something just because they didn't know themselves enough about what I knew I wanted to do, and so they pretended that I had to squeeze in their own kind of narrower, let's say, mindedness, rather than the other way around. That's, in my opinion, a very important aspect too, because giving trust to a student, say, or at least in a student's intuition, is, especially in history, incredibly important, because history is so huge and complex that everybody really follow their own path by a certain degree. You shouldn't try to hamper that. I remember there was a professor of the department. She was perhaps the best one we had. She was quite revered, kind of the old guard style lady with the reputation of being kind of ice cold and to have dedicated her entire life to history and knowing literally everything about lots of things. And she was really a mind, and she is still. I saw her recently as well, but she doesn't teach there anymore because she retired. I never had her as my professor and so on. She was not really that sympathetic, telling you the truth, but she was intelligent and clever, and she knew how to handle my work. And I remember when because she was curious about it in part, but also not too much to get too much involved. Mainly she wanted to see if I was actually working, because she was the responsible of the department. So that was the only contact we really had. She's a weird type, but surely she was a valuable historian. Specializing in actually ecclesiastical history, so lots of things that, especially monasticism. And we had multiple professors doing that, too many. Telling the truth, it was either that or history of economics, some way. And so my tutor was the only one who was a bit more political in interest. In fact, made me understand lots of things. And it's fair to say she made me understand history in a serious sense, at least what the method of it all is meant to be, and what kind of questions you have to pose yourself, at least how to pose yourself questions, and what always maintaining that there has to be a logic that also others have to understand. That's crucial, in my opinion. It was one of the most solid and important lessons that I've ever received, just by not classes, but just specific paths in a way, and prolonged work. And I remember this older professor instead, literally, we were all intimidated by her, but when I was presenting the project to the various professors' department, she posed me a question. I remember what exactly. It was a pretty amicable one, like, well, I don't remember, but I realized, and she said openly and loudly, well, then I don't know, because I'm not an expert in military history, so I don't know what this broader thing. It was a simple thing, like, whether cavalry or infantry increase or decrease in a certain period in a certain context. And this person, from the, let's say, height of her competence, had the and she was not being dismissive, because she said, like, military history is not important, whatever. Not at all, but she simply said, I don't know anything about these things because I never studied them. That made me understand, in the broader issue, unfortunately, that we have with military history that is not properly studied and so on, especially the art of war properly meant, that such a knowledgeable person could have the humility and the honesty of accepting that it was not her thing, and she had never read about that. And so admitting that there is also a field, a branch that she wouldn't investigate. Whereas these are very intelligent professors who really shift from different times, places. One of the few people who knew what happened abroad, who had a broader. This also thanks to probably her monastic interest, because she studied monasticism as a European phenomenon. And I must say, every time I see people that are able to study things at that European scale, they are really talents, and that is a forced mechanism, in my opinion. And if you study something more complex, if you study more, and she had studied more, like my tutor, in comparison to her, is like a kid, right, who just knows their own stuff too. But at least she's humble in the same way. In fact, I liked very much them as human types, even though they're quite different. They stayed in the same room. Also, my tutor retired now. But it was a beautiful period, because I could go there and ask them things, and it was quite fascinating. And the, let's say, this thing of what professor didn't know, unfortunately, increased, like, like an evidence later, as things got more interesting from a strictly scientific and also moral point of view. And I'm talking, of course, about the doctorate, and I will talk about this. As I explained countless times during the doctorate, there is a bit this, like, we arrived to the point that only doctoral students are taken in consideration for what they say. If you start university during the bachelor, at this point in history, like, you're literally nobody. And nobody rightfully cares even about what you think in general. I mean, yes, you may say interesting things that can provoke the professor's interest, especially if they become your tutor. In fact, my one was a bit like this. She was very open to different ideas, also because she didn't know some of these topics, but she always said, you know what, I don't know about this, you don't know about this, but let's figure it out together, which is a beautiful way of approaching the thing as well. That really reveals you that what truly open-mindedness really means. And I treasured that a lot because, by the way, I'm right-wing, she was left-wing, but as historians we found ourselves on the same ground. So these experiences also teach you that we can't solve problems if we really are, let's say, intelligent in the subject matter enough, right? So that you can come from different backgrounds, but at the end of the day, especially when you reconstruct something historically, you're talking about the same thing that happened for real in only one way. And so the task there is, in fact, figuring out exactly what happened. And having different perspectives is crucial. Even when there are perspectives that you kind of don't like, but they always give you something to think, and especially the less knowledgeable and experienced you are, and the more defensive you get just because you think that this thing could harm your reputation if it makes you look too stupid. Eventually, later, you understand instead that this is the sap of history. There is also probably a community level of ghostly value in that kind of knowledge and understanding. In any case, there is this fear that the doctoral student will not make it, and this stems mostly from administrative bureaucratic reasons, because the departments get money if you succeed and so on. So nobody wants really you to fail, right? So it can happen. If you don't do anything, they will not let you pass. But you're going to be pressured. And as I said before, I had a very few times and time in general, rather than occasions and chances, to explain what I was really researching in front of the professors. That in part they don't know the topic, especially my own. They can't know it if you have only 20 minutes because they couldn't find a better way to make students speak. And also that are generally skeptical towards anything that the kiddo does there, right? This guy's inexperienced, he's talking about castles in the air. He doesn't really get the point. I'm a pretty, let's say, introverted person, so sometimes it's not easy to, like, I'm sociable and all, which is absolutely not incompatible with introversion. But the point being is that I work very much from the within, and so eventually it takes time to produce what I'm, and to translate in action what I think about, because I think it's really important to sort it out first in order to at least make it develop over time. So it was complicated in a way to present the project, or at least the work that I was doing once I was in. And generally speaking, I was not believed. This is the impression that I received. That nobody really understood what I was talking about, but that this derived from an ignorance in the subject matter that automatically made them defensive about themselves. In other words, I was challenging them, because I was telling them, look, there is a huge hole in the historiography. Nobody realized this, and I want to fix this. And the thing seemed too big, and they wouldn't quite believe in what I was doing or how I was doing it, and specifically what I really meant. And as I said, until you know even the topic, you can't have the dimension of what it means. So we're trying to shipwrecked me towards a much narrower, minimalistic direction. For example, my thesis, I will explain it, but in a broader way, was about the systemic study of 60 years of military history in a given European region in ultra detail. That is to say, every single source I had to use military-wise, and I did. It took 4 years, 3 years and a half, and I succeeded. Nobody thought this was possible because I did only this in those years, except from Schwerpunkt, basically, and it was largely a chronicle, chronicle-based work, right? And this, first of all, they don't like because not because they have anything against chronicles, but because they don't use them the way they should, right? And they prefer to rely on archives, for which, if they find a single document, a notary document, they find just a file of this kind of information, they will and make a thesis on it. They will erect a statue to them, just by historiographical convention. If somebody studies military history, nobody really cares. And notoriously, in the archives, you will find a very few about military history in the first place, especially in the period I study, but not so especially, but let's say notoriously for anyone who has studied the historiography existing, like that is to say archive sources in the sense of works that are not chronicles, that are known openly in version since the time they were written without any further archive research, if anything, just maybe for refining the various versions, but not altering substantially the content, is below 5%. And thus it's useless. In other words, without chronicles, without narrative sources, you can't write military history by any stretch of the imagination. It's not something that holds eventually a bigger work based on other types of sources. It's literally the virtual entirety of the work. And this is already something that, first of all, because military history is not studied, but also because everybody hyper-specialized in this idea, oh, look, I found a new thing in the archive. This is important, even if it's insignificant, even if I will write a thesis nobody will ever read, that nobody's interested in, articles that, again, will be read perhaps by chance by bored researchers who have to quote you just because you came close to the topic they are working on, and they have to cite you to quote you for the sake of completion, not because they give a damn about your work, or it's not even their own specific topic. Well, all the rest does not exist according to them, and you have to pay the consequences of this. There was a guy, specifically a professor in this, let's say, my department, who didn't like my idea, or at least that criticized it without, again, knowing even what it was. And perhaps I will talk about this in a video dedicated to the criticism to my doctoral thesis. That is a very important topic, because you must... The criticism is incredibly useful, not much because somebody tells you, look, this is wrong, you fix it and you improve your work, but because you understand that you didn't do enough to be understood yourself. So it's a dramatic improvement because you can pump blood into the system that you have already created and reinvigorate it in a way that is even more mind-blowing than you thought. And there are things about historical ignorance that this guy provided with in general during these meetings, and I was quite open and frank about this thing of the sources, and also in the fact that it didn't seem to me that anybody had fully understood what I was doing, including my tutor, and I said it in front of her and him at the same time, because they wanted to help me out, not because I was in difficulty. Actually, I was working pretty well, but because they still didn't understand what I was doing. And that year there had been a disciplinary measure that had been taken, let's say, to prevent students to fail their doctorate, because there was a colleague of ours that the year before had almost had her right towards the end, she had not finished, and she hadn't told it anyone, so they feared that I may be do the same thing as well as any other. I know they're pressuring the new kids now. They're in a terrifying way, and we were the last lucky year in which we didn't have much control. It was fantastic, as I explained many times. But there is all this premise to explain to you how important it was actually one specific ignorance from the side of this guy when I actually handed them in December 2020 the let's say the version that I would have had eventually to refine in the following months before I would finish in March. It's an internal thing. Technically, it was just an informal one because there are external correctors. So these professors didn't have any power, and they were not there to block my thesis at all. Everything went well, as you know, later too with the true correctors. But they had to give a look at it and say, okay, let's give, however, still a preliminary opinion on it, so that in these months, that usually is just 1 month, but they had extended our scholarship because of COVID. So I was lacking that too. Could be fixed, right? If there are some big problems or issues or even the most banal things, we can give it a check and fix the last details, right? This was normally done in much more emergential ways that normally had just 1 month. It's, you know, normally most doctorates require years to be fixed afterwards, because if you want everything to be perfect, especially in 600, 700 pages, like in my case, it was crazy. And that's the reason why I may probably not publish the thesis eventually, when just writing articles like crazy from it, because there is really a gold mine there. But the pros and cons, also the formal side of the story. But what really displeased me, like I have stories basically almost in all the, at the end of all the my educational cycles, that displaced me about people, either arguments, or you know, this kind of, mostly arguments in fact, but say being disappointed by the system per se, because the people in it are not fit. Well, the professor, this was done in a video call because, you know, December 2020, you know, remember, we couldn't go out, and the university was closed anyway, so we actually couldn't even speak because of some technical issues they had at the time. Anyway, this were just 3 professors of my department. By the way, in theory there should be all of them. Instead, at least other 3 didn't even, to whom I had sent the thesis, by the way, didn't even participate. I don't know whether that's the praxis, but it's just impolite. Like, this is a guy that has been working there for 3-4 years. Also with the difficulties of the last year especially, and that sent you the thesis to read, and you basically would never provide them with even you know, with that information. It's not because it was my thesis, but it was in general so. And maybe because it was my thesis, I don't know. I don't want to know about that, which was a thesis that, in any case, pleased very much the correctors. So, again, I think it's just a broader rudeness, and or I agree that you can't read 600 pages, but some did, right? And my professors did fairly, you know, this spoke to me at least did in a fair way, except actually 4 professors, and of 3 of these, well, they pointed out, look, there is maybe here to fix this for fix that, the work is fine, don't worry, it's gonna do well, just do this and that, everything will be perfect, nobody will even stop your thesis the way it is now, just notice that you can improve. This other professor that had never that the last time we had met basically had asked me to do for no reason, by the way, because it was not my tutor or anything, just the department had decided that he was the random guy that could give me an advice, not even the expert or anything, but he said, okay, I will do it. I said, why don't you do the archive thing? And what the fuck did I have to do with the archive? Again, especially if you have understood what kind of work I'm doing, which was a colossal one, and again, something that had never been attempted in that specific field in my country, and finally was filling that damn gap. Like, why should I have to waste time in an archive? You haven't understood anything. I'm working with, you know, tens of thousands of quotes from evidence nobody has ever analyzed for the topic that we care about. You asked me to go out to spend further months, by the way, with COVID and all these things, for what, right? For saying that I have a piece of paper from, say, the 14th century that says one thing that has virtually no relevance for the entire system. I'm talking about properly the size of armies, how often they campaigned, what kind of tactics they use. Well, what do you think will happen if I find one damn archive document that is also not even to be certain to be out there? It's spending a lot of time, first of all, a lot of energy, a lot of money for something that is what is, and I quoted that in the same thesis from other actual experts in the field that says it's anti-economical. You will not find what you will find. So first of all, I'm writing this to you. You don't get shit, but you're complex, by the way, and because this person also has a physical complex, and I sadly noticed that this is often the case with complex people, that they don't grow up straight, mentally speaking, and they feel always somewhat paranoid. And this guy essentially mocked me for no reason, by the way. I mean, mildly, in ways that, however, I don't take lightly, especially when they're stupid. Like, I have self-irony, as you know. But when, as you will hear now, the entire thing was wrong, because he was wrong, and he misquoted every single thing that he was pretending to be an evidence, and you're a professor, right? And you're allegedly trying to correct somebody who has to become a doctor like you. Well, you just look like the kid there. Because this guy first of all said, but this is not, he started like this, like, haha, this, first of all, laughing. The fuck do you laugh about? I don't know my other professors laughing, especially in such a circumstance, where the mood is relaxed because they say, oh, fine, this guy wrote a good thing, and this guy begins to say, but this is a completely different work from the one I asked you to do, and say, I didn't answer that, fortunately. Also, unfortunately, I couldn't speak in that thing, because if I had spoken, probably something wrong would have happened, because, I don't let stupid things pass. So, from such statement, you would imagine, first of all, there is something wrong, and that if there is, you will explain me the entire thing. It says, but now I don't have time to to say what I had to be like now it's too late, like this work is being written this other way instead. Well, thanks to my eyes, it's my work, and that's how I intended to work on it. And has also other professors, including my tutor there, were quite supportive of, because she admitted it was the only possible way the thing could be written in the first place, and this person is also a bit more experienced than you. Professor of history economics, by the way, so always the materialistic, deterministic, chthonic, leftistic, we can't say, at least I don't know exactly about him, but generally speaking, somebody who studied history of economics, in my opinion, most of the times has some bias that may not be leftistic, but still, focusing too much on that means to miss the entire point of the story that is primarily political, right? Then military, then social, and economy is just framed conceptually within the social dimension. Not that all these don't overlap, but it doesn't have just per se saying, why not art then? Why not, I don't know, science, right? Why economics, right? Only, and why so important? But we all know why in the Western world, history of economics had that specific weight, which is political and for the wars. But anyhow, this guy says, well, so I laugh about it. Basically, that's what I was saying. But not about the work, but about the fact that it was done in a different way from the one he had said. So first of all, centering the attention on himself, like saying, look, I was the special person that you should have listened to, and you made it differently. Haha, what does it even mean? Especially considering that the thesis worked well, and quite well. You're the person that doesn't know about that, who's not specialized in it, who pretended to give me an advice that I didn't follow because it would have not made the work. You're already getting on my nerves. In a moment in which, by the way, I'm strained because I worked all the time. As you know, at the time, I even suspended Schwerpunkt for a while because I had to write all the bibliography. It was terrifying, as it happens in the end. And then he says, well, I don't have time to, well, to think. But, for example, one thing. Listen to which one thing there really was. There was a criticism, by the way, once it was okay. It was like you quoted, for example, some old works, like if in a chronicle there was a the mention of, I don't know, 200 men at arms fighting in one instance in 1342 in one place. I noted it. I noted the chronicle, and I noted to accompany it, for example, I don't know, 19th century historians like Gregorovius. So somebody says, you should have quoted about Rome, let's say in the history of Rome and Gregorovius, more updated studies. Which ones? About military history. Because Gregorovius is making, in the old historiographical fashion, a history, a chronicle, basically, on the base of other chronicles. Which other studies that I read, by the way, much updated to the last years, about subject matter that do not talk fundamentally even about warfare, because nobody writes about them, that do not talk about this single event. I'm just using for the sake of the list that I made, the huge list of all the contingents that were studied, and it was quite fruitful. So, okay, you don't like that I quote an old study. What for exactly? If there is not one that fixes it, you're just saying it for the sake, because you presume in your own field that somebody has written something more recently about the topic. Unfortunately, I read the entire historiography about military history, and nobody talks about that specific event. Because I would have, quoted it, or at least if it is quoted somewhere, it's not because it's an object of military study, because that's the historiography that I checked. In any case, you don't understand the method. You don't understand what I'm doing. Okay, well, I can't accept this, but you want to correct me about one given historical point. So this is the proof in which the great historian should show the professor is more expert than the guy. So this guy, I think, quoted me on the siege of Zara by Venice in the 40s of the 14th century. This is the wars between Venice and Hungary, and it was a big deal of an operation, a siege and so on. And I said that I quoted a history, I think it was of the 18th century, was quoting a now lost medieval chronicle, so very important evidence. It was not even a chronicle, it was documents, properly archived documents. It said that this expedition had costed 1 million ducats. And I had quoted it. And I admit this, that at the time I didn't know what the ducat equated to. Most of my thesis was in florins, calculated. And for this reason, I hadn't checked ahead of time. But I didn't talk about ducats because I didn't quote much Venetian history or anything around that equivalence. Then I found out that the ducat equated to a florin, more or less. And it was a perfectly suitable measure, because there are instances in which the papal armies spent more than 1 million florins for a single war of a couple of years. It was a massive siege of the same operational scale. Why not costing 1 million ducats? The aforementioned million being studied thoroughly by historiography, with all the sources, with all the updated studies and so on. So this moron says, first of all, here you quoted that Venice spent 1 million ducats for the siege of Zara, but this is unastro. This is properly like it means that you don't know even what it means economy at the time. You don't, maybe, because you don't know how much money was spent for war normally. So this a deliberate insult to a student that is quoting, that is giving you a source, by the way. It's not that I invented it. Every single thing was sourced extensively, by the way. And it was sourced from a study, it was sourced from an archive source. So this is pretty dumb, first of all, because if you have problems with that, the first thing you do as a historian is to go check the source, and at best you criticize the source that I use, not the fact that I wrote what is written in the source that is also correct, both in the way I quoted it and both in the fact that it's entirely plausible that that was the amount of a military expense. And this idiot does what, first of all? First of all, he insinuates that I don't know anything about history of economics. Well, yes, because I'm not a dirty communist that spends his life on this kind of materialistic, structuralistic garbage that fortunately in the academy we're getting rid of abundantly and criticizing it specifically. So if you feel you have water at your neck, it's your problem, and you deal with your own shit. You don't blame others in the process. Secondly, what he does, he invents that I had allegedly mixed with another, this event with another one, confused it with the 600,000 ducats. That is also not that far from 1 million. If that was a terribly incredible figure that was not plausible, for which you don't know what history of economics is, why then 600,000 wouldn't be in that case. That was instead what was paid in the 60s by the Venetians to reacquire control on Tsar, something like that, to the Hungarians. That the guy remembered because had studied that part of Eastern, like of Hungarian history, and he remembered the 600 ducats, and he had never heard of the million before, so he had to think, even though I quoted the source that explains it. This was from the 40s, from the famous siege of Tsar, by the way, of the 40s. That I had mixed it up means you haven't even checked the sources. In other words, you are criticizing somebody for something that you do not know because you're too ignorant to have never heard. You don't even check the sources that I provide you with. So first of all, you couldn't pass even a bachelor exam if this is your historical method. And secondly, you try to correct me by saying something that is even wrong, that is completely confusing the event with another, and insinuating that I was the one that I did. When I said this around, everybody was like, first of all, this is the only guy among those four that behaved like that. The others just wanted to get it over with and say, okay, everything, fix this and that, everything's fine. Broader way of maybe add a little bit of introduction in this chapter, this kind of little things that you do, right? They may be costly at that point where you're exhausted, but they're not a problem in the thesis. This guy behaves like a clown and confirms to be one by saying something that even somebody who's not a doctor, unlike him, could easily and had easily informed him with, and that he didn't even check. What kind of historian it is. When I said this story to my tutor, that had noticed the thing, by the way, to my other colleagues, everybody said, yeah, this guy is kind of a moron, right? Even my colleague of modern history that said that this guy was a friend to him says, yeah, if you behave like a moron, that you want to be the precise one, and then you even get it wrong, you have problems. And this person definitely has problems. And the problem is that he's an ignorant. That is to say, as a historian, doesn't understand history, doesn't understand the process of our research, doesn't understand the process of quoting, doesn't understand the process properly of that broader society that he's allegedly trying to describe just through economics, and that doesn't even understand consequently by saying that something impossible to have happened did actually happen, as it mostly happens with deterministic background and this kind of likelihood based on absolutely subjective principles, as if, by the way, the histories, the sources of the past, had even read it, were just so a bunch of idiots, and they were the intelligent ones. And so something could be easily debunked even just by the comparison with the other millions paid in the same years in other military theaters. But especially this is due to the fact that this person is an ignorant. This person doesn't know, again, what the historical business is. And so, if I think back at my childhood, again, at those professors that didn't know how to speak correctly the language, or that thought that Sinai is in Africa, or that, and other things, you realize that that vulgarity, that chthonic, inferior, undercultured, underdeveloped, underschooled mass of the lesser has been rooting and polluting our world by even in institutions that were revered, right? Professors of the generation of my, of the professors of my professors, let's say, the older ones, especially, were people that were living encyclopedias. These ones here are the real kids, are the real dumbasses that thought that this world would always go up forever without any effort, just by hyper specializing, narrowing their own brains down to nothingness. And I think now, especially my generation, is to say that the in part the millennials, yes, but the ones that specifically followed this path, and especially born in the early 90s and so on, will be aware of, let's squeezed in between this phase of wealth and this phase of stagnation, that will have to cope with the extremes and handling them also as an establishment. And I think, also looking at my colleagues, that we're looking at much more competent people than the previously, let's say, the immediately previous generations, which is one of the only few optimistic notes that I can point out. It is the system will collapse anyways. It's already collapsing, but the quality of the individuals will not. At least some of these ones, the ones that will, yeah, generations either fucked up. There is no, I'm sorry about that. It will be just the slaves of the third millennium in this beginning. There is no doubt about that. Right, those are over with. They properly. They also don't know history. Like, we are the last ones that had an idea of the type of historical awareness that, with all its faults, at least existed as such. Right. After that, it's nothingness. But this is yet another topic. But in other words, I think that the main reason why this whole thing collapse is this kind of tolerance, is this kind of, let's say, moral relativism, this kind of incompetence, and at the end of the day, this kind of lack of knowledge. Like, if you don't know things, if you don't work with them, if you don't build them up, you cannot practically have a concrete understanding of the world. And so you will transform the world in a fantasy niche that you carved under your pillow to look at night, pretending that that's your precious thing that will save you from there. No, it means that you have already delegated your own humanity to something outside of yourself, and you will pay for it. You have already paid, because humanity has already fallen further in the process, and it will probably drag down also the elite of those who could make this coming back along in the next generations, because we can hold, but when we will be dead, probably the world will have lost that guidance, right? It will be a much weaker world in terms probably of reactional capacities. There will be just many more poorer, more ignorant, and more stupid people around, ruled by oligarchies of mediocre competence, but that at least know how to handle that minimum to make the thing remaining together. It will be a very different world from the one we have been experiencing. Happily, if anything, I must say, from my side, in childhood, like, not that those times were perfect in the history of even of the most developed countries, but at least they gave you a sense of a new order that was perceived as an evangelical mission. Whereas now, that very concept is demonized because at least there were a few people who understood the full implications of the former point, and that now think that they can get anything of their own personal misery and failure back from the collapse of the same, and that will actually make them sink first. Right? I already know that unless there is a major world catastrophe, I will, for example, not starve in my time. Right? That I always have the resources. Most people today may not be able to tell this, not even properly in the West on average, right? And so this is not really this is not a catastrophe. This is going to go bad for everyone, like in the world. This is not just about the West, or it's mostly the West problem. Actually, we are, again, in perspective, also the ones that can afford to relax more, or at least to make leverage on some systems that allow us, that are already here, that are well structured after all, and that can make us stay afloat. But it will not go better in general, right? Unless we manage to stick to the values that the West has consolidated, not the ones that are the generational face of them. And as long as there will be stupid enough people to pretend that incapable of distinguishing the good and the bad from the same Western civilization, just to hate it entirely, either both within it and outside of it, well, we will lord on them. So they will become our next slaves, and in this moral order of nature, frankly, there is no problem, because they have made themselves slaves, and they have, in some cases, born slaves mentally. So, they just collect what they sow, let's say. In any case, I think that, looking at this broader folds, and I'm surely forgetting about some of them, some things that I've heard that are atrocious, that give the impression that I outlined, that it's a bit of a big fake, right? That they are acting mostly, that they're selling dust at higher prices than they should. Well, it's a feature of the system. So yes, if you're outside of the system, you can legitimately look at it and say, as far as that, they're not really so competent, right? University professors are not so competent in the way you would expect at least them to be in their solid knowledge, or that properly the frame of their knowledge is that solid more than else. Because again, specifically, specialistically, they are good at what they do in their own limited field, but this doesn't mean that you can use, that they have the knowledge or that anybody has in large numbers collectively in the world to use this knowledge in a functional way. What you cannot say indeed is that we can do without them, though. That the common people have any idea what the hell is going on, that they know better, that even starving is a reason to tear down the system. First of all, nobody's starving in that way, at least in the populistic propaganda that is made continuously, nor anybody has a better idea of what is going on than the experts. So if you hate the experts, it's because, of course, from one side you can perceive that they're not enough collectively, but there is no other out of them that actually knows what the hell to do. So everybody's good at criticizing. Everybody can have the possibility of seeing a fault, but how many do have the capacity of instead building up something without competence? That's another issue, right? Tearing down the system, any form of iconoclasm, frankly, is a denial of a civilizational value. Because if you are superior to that, you just overcome it, right? These things always happen, always exist, but you're able to move forward. If you're for the better. If you don't, it means your civilization is shrinking, and so your culture is becoming inferior to before. And again, having passed through this part of history, even in my relatively young existence, I think that I can already see a chronological spectrum within which you can perceive also the generational change, what is going on specifically in terms of competence, incompetence, and who should do what, that I think nobody's really addressing nowadays. It seems the entire attention is drawn towards what individual no ones feel about, mostly the fact that they can't tolerate even a minimal effort in their lives, and looking at who's the cringes in accomplishing that, right? So the cheaper, the weaker, the emptier, the less articulate, the less developed, the less knowledgeable, the better. Because so those who feel that weakness within themselves can feel justified to keep feeling weaker and getting weaker in the process. So this is a bit like my entire point that I see. It's all the world does age. Things do disappear, even when we build materially. That what really matters is what we have within, and so hardly any accomplishment in having a system that kind of holds on itself, but still the people are emptied by emptied of their own moral potential, right? We will come back to a pretty large phase of stagnation, I believe. I don't see a major radical change in a big step forward unless there is something technologically coming about, but still probably also making the problem further worse. Because the problem is not technology, the problem is how much you decide to entrust yourself to it, or at least to delegate some functions that would that you give technology the task of carrying out, but that if you knew how to do yourself, still you would use that technology even in a better way than the one that it does, right? So the problem is not technology, the problem is people. This is what unfortunately the entire paradigm is being shifted. How many, again, unsatisfied anti-civilizationists, most of the times ethno-nationalists and so on, say, the problem is technology. What kind of men are you, traditionally speaking, to be so weak to entrust yourself willing to? It's not that technology takes you over. Like, the entire traditional point is that if matter takes you over, it's because you're weak and you deserve that. Because it's in the order of things. If you pursue God, you are to come closer to it and being ever more powerful in the process. So there may be a destiny of fall because of our nature, but this is exactly what we're seeing. That the reason why that happens is that nobody seems to accept that flawed nature, that and the fact that this is not just a permanent thing per se, but it's intrinsic in the possibility of fixing it, at least by some margin. And so staying afloat, if you really care about the entire thing in the process, not giving up. So this aspect to me is particularly crucial. At least I discuss it in other videos, but it's a bit like I saw today. Let's pretend that professors are competent. Let's pretend that as doctors we are competent, and not look at our own flaws. And so it's the best way to make the entire system collapse, because we have a duty not to ourselves, but to something out of ourselves, including the community, that can confer us with a much greater power than the individual once summed, and that thus seem really, the idea, you're abandoning any responsibility. You're letting the ship sinking without even trying to save it anymore. You will not be able to teach effectively anyone. You will just let these people falling in their own delusions that taking a degree has anything to do with their intelligence, with their success, with their capacity. And then you cannot complain eventually if your children are go to school being taught by people that are practically more ignorant than what you could make your children be if you just taught them something adequately on your own. But anyhow, we will keep talking about this topics in different forms and ways. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.